for leading last week. You led the discussion on mothers. Today we're going to be doing friendship. And I haven't heard any particular requests as far as, chapters you want to make sure we get to. So we're just going to keep kind of plodding through chapter by chapter. Means we probably won't get to the chapter on death at the end. That's okay. So we're going to keep going with we're basically following the women's schedule because there's a little bit more structure of the videos and all. And so I think they're going 2 weeks after spring break. So, let's see if I can find my calendar here. So let's see here. So yeah, we don't meet on the 9th, and then we will meet on the 16th and the 23rd, and we'll start something new on the 30th. No, we don't know what that is yet, but we'll start something new, I think is the plan, on the 30th. So, but obviously I wasn't here last week because of driving to New York. So that did go well, as well as I can to drive into New York with the U-Haul trailer. So I took borrowed my brother's truck and drove up there, and we stopped just outside of New York on the way in. So Monday night, I'll say my wife put me in maybe the worst hotel I've ever seen in my life. She apologized. It was. She's like, because of the U-Haul, she was trying to find a trailer that didn't have an exit that didn't have a lot at it, so that I wouldn't get stuck somewhere, which is, I appreciate because I can't back up, I can only go straight. And so, so that was, she was trying to be considerate of that, but when you pick an exit that doesn't have a lot in the middle of Pennsylvania, it's not safe. And so this was basically a truck stop is what it was. Like the hotel was all hard floors because, not nice hard floors, like they just ripped the carpet out and had concrete. Hard floors. And then I said, is there a place to eat? He's like, well, there's a place down the street. Pretty sure it's a strip club. So, anyway, it was an interesting night. So I ate at a gas station called Sheets. I don't know if you guys know what that is. So anyway, but that was Monday. And then we drove in to New York on Tuesday, and we had hired whatever they call them. It's not even day labor, it's hourly labor. We hired a guy to be there for an hour to help us load stuff. And so I was trying to time like getting there exactly the same time as him, basically, which worked out we were pretty close. So we got there at about 11:15, and we really got the trailer loaded in an hour. And then we were out of New York in 90 minutes. So that was. So I was in New York for 90 minutes. A little longer than that, actually, because it took me driving around New York for a while. But for the most part, it went, like I said, about as well as it could have gone, I guess. She's home, and she is here, so looking for a job. So let's keep her in prayers that she can find a job. She wants to move to Chattanooga, so she's looking for a job down that direction. Anyway, that's why I was gone. So let me pray for us, and we'll dive in here and look at the chapter on friendship. Father, we thank you for this time. We thank you for this opportunity to meet together. We thank you for this book and the way that it helps us to think about our desires, how they can become disordered, and how they can become reordered as we live into your gospel. Father, we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so like I said, we're doing the chapter on friendship, and he starts the chapter with this paradox, or what he calls a paradox anyway, that the road movies, these on-the-road movies, these setting out to find life movies, are often buddy movies. It's not usually a solo guy. It's often two people, two guys, two women going off to find themselves. And he calls that a paradox. And kind of understanding why that's a paradox, I think, is a helpful starting point for us to kind of get at what he's trying to get at in this chapter. And so, if you had a chance to read it, or maybe you can just reflect on it, why is it a paradox to say that an on-the-road movie would be a buddy movie, would be a movie about friends going. Why does he consider that to be something that's a little bit counterintuitive?
Our individualism remains oddly convenient.
Okay, yeah. So if you think about it, I mean, and that's actually the force that he says is pushing against the world. He says even when we try to define authenticity in entirely individualistic terms, the world still can't. They can't make a movie about a guy going by himself. They're still going to make a movie about friends, even though they don't quite understand it. But that's actually the disorder. And the reason it's a paradox is because if you think about the way the world defines authenticity, he gets into some fairly heavy philosophy here with Heidegger and some other guys, and Sartre and whatnot. But you can see it at Disney too. He has a quote later in the chapter about Disney. He says, "This is the generic cultural version of authenticity that we drink up with our Disney." He says Disney Channel subscription, which dates him, but the Disney Plus subscription, if you want to put it that way. He says the idea that you resist the crowd, rise above the masses, be true to yourself. I remember when I was teaching Bible over TCPS, that's when Frozen came out, and that whole Let It Go song. I played that song for my kids, and they just totally resonate with that. You gotta let it go, forget everybody else's expectations, forget everybody else's demands, forget any other obligation that's on you, do your own thing. Like this is freedom, this is life. And he said that is the sort of the definition of authenticity that we drink up from our culture. To be authentic, you have to be true to yourself. To be authentic, you can't bow to anybody else's expectations. To be authentic, you have to kind of throw off all sort of external constraints. And so that he says it this way on page 122. He says, authenticity then always looks like an emergence from them, refusal of conformity, because inauthenticity is, by definition, a failure to resist the domination of others, the tyranny of the they. Others constitute an existential threat. Others represent a diminishment of my freedom. And that just sort of vibe, I guess, is out there in the culture. And so that's kind of where I want to start with this idea of, how have we felt that? Right? How have we experienced that sense that the obligations of others are an unfair burden over us in a way, that they're contrary to our freedom, they're contrary to authenticity. Have you ever felt like I just got to throw off the they, I got to throw off the other, I got to throw off the shackles of expectation in order to do my own thing? Where have we felt that in our own lives, in our experience?
I don't know that I've actually felt it, but I think about people who retire and buy an RV and then just go travel around the country, like parking in different campsites for months and months at a time. And that sounds so wonderful, be totally free from any schedule, and go to beautiful places and all this kind of stuff. But to me, it just seems like a total nightmare. First of all, you're driving an enormous vehicle all the time, which is stressful and tiring, and then secondly, you have no community whatsoever.
Yeah.
Maybe one other person is along with you, your wife or whatever, but you're just totally isolated. To me, that is not my dream for retirement. My dream for retirement is meeting together with the same guys every morning for breakfast and doing crossword puzzles or something. Just having fun together,
people you spend life with.
People don't have any community with for decades.
What happens though is those people who move around in RVs, who seem to be isolated, they form their own communities and they travel in packs. They're basically RV gangs.
They go from one place to another. Superannuated RV gangs. Yes.
But others, anybody else can think of a time when they have felt this?
Yeah, when I came out of high school, I went to engineering school. The only real criteria I had was my dad said, your uncle's an engineer, he made a lot of money,
This is what you do.
I feel, I don't know if it's really strong, but I definitely feel if I didn't, have to go to work, then I would be free of those responsibilities. If I was married, I would be free of those responsibilities. Whatever commitments I have, I didn't have those commitments. So I feel that, whatever, it's kind of a desire to be totally free of any obligation. Terrible. But I do feel, I can sense that, especially if things are stressful, any one of those circles, just back out of that circle.
Yeah.
Is that,
No, I think that's exactly right. I think people, I think you see that with like you said, families sometimes where people just walk away. You see with churches, where people walk in, there's obligations there. If you're there, there's certain expectations about, you're expected to be a participant, you're expected to contribute, you're expected to be a neighbor, and I don't want to do that. And people will walk away. And I think we feel at different stages in different ways. I know when I went, all my life I heard that I was going to be a pastor when I grew up. You're just like your dad, you're going to be, and there was no way I was going to do that. I felt that myself. Just like, no, I don't want to be subjected to that. Pressure, like you said, that I actually went to seminary and then stopped and became to our own time. Because I was like, this is not right. I'm not here for the right reasons. We had me kind of take a semester off. It's like, I need to think through, am I really supposed to be here? I think we've all felt it at different times. And Smith, as he's commented on this sense of authenticity as that sort of total freedom, he says behind Heidegger's account of authenticity and Sartre's notion of freedom, which has seeped into our collective popular consciousness in ways we still don't realize, is a take on inner subjectivity, on what it means for human beings to be alongside each other, sharing a world. It is a take on being with, and that take is overwhelmingly negative. All right? And so his point is that basically the current culture's definition of authenticity, what it means to be authentic, what it means to be true to yourself, makes others the enemy. Because you cannot be in a relationship with others without having some sort of reciprocity, without having some sort of expectation, without having some sort of obligation. Just being in a relationship puts obligations on you. Just being in community, you have an obligation to respond to love. And we so want to throw those off that others become the enemy when we are really trying to be true to ourselves. And I saw this in any number of my daughter's peers, including her, in New York. They all kind of wanted to be themselves, but they wanted the others to be their friends, but they were all trying to be themselves, and so they had a really hard time being friends with each other. Because it's like, you need to be my sidekick. No, you need to be my sidekick. Let my life define, and you've come with me. And that's what they all wanted. They all wanted others to come with them, but they could never agree about where they were going because they all wanted to be the main character. None of them wanted to be the sidekick. And she would never say it that way, of course. But that's my dad's perspective. I was like, there's a reason that you keep having conflict with all your friends. Because you all want everything to be about you, but so does she, and so does she, and so does he, and so does he, and it's no wonder you guys can't get along. So anyway, that's the idea that we have this, like the way he starts is we have this sort of unsuppressible need for others, and yet we also have this definition of authenticity that's totally at odds with community. And so he said, basically when we want authenticity, we actually are wanting to belong to something. We're wanting to be part of a community that in which we find our identity. That's kind of where he's going with all of this. And so he has this quote from this guy named Marcel, who's responding to Heidegger. This is on page 124. He says, is this not plainly contrary? So is Heidegger's definition of authenticity not plainly contrary to our experience? Is there anyone who isn't indebted to a past that makes our choices possible, to relationships that have birthed and formed the I with agency? Maybe freedom looks different from such fabulous independence. Maybe others could be our friends. And I think this is where he's driving us, is to begin to see, that you're actually not independent. No matter how free you think you are, how much you cut yourself off from other people, you actually never will be independent. There's only one necessary being, and that's God. It's not you. And so, regardless of what you strive after or what you think about yourself, you're always going to be contingent. Even the I that makes the choices to renounce the others was made possible by your parents, and made possible by the community that you grew up in. And so this idea that having to kind of learn, relearn. So this is his thesis, I guess, on page 124. It says, to refuse the existentialist script for authenticity is not to embrace inauthenticity. It is to imagine why friends are gifts and how grace is communal, how I find myself in community. And so that's really, what's the disorder here? What is the disorder? This whole book is about disordered love. It's about our disordered desires. And the disorder that he's wanting us to see in this friendship is that a false sense, a false desire for authenticity as independence leads us to see friends as enemies rather than gifts. He said, if you understand authenticity as communal, it actually frees you to see other people as the gifts. It reminds me, he doesn't use the story in the chapter, but it reminds me of the story that Lewis told about Tolkien. Remember where he said when Tolkien died, Lewis said, he said, I thought for a moment, who was the other third? There was a third person in the group. Well, Percy or McDonald. Yeah, okay. So, so Lewis and McDonald. He said, now I thought I was going to get McDonald all to myself. He said, but actually I got less than McDonald because Tolkien wasn't there to draw out those aspects of his personality that I couldn't. And just recognizing that, there's obligations within friendship, but it's also what makes life rich. And you actually find yourself in ways you can't even imagine in relationship because it's the way you were created. And so that's again kind of what he's trying to get us to. But if that's you kind of said earlier, Scott, I kind of feel this, but then I know better. So if we kind of know better, why? What's the draw? I guess we need to kind of diagnose that a little bit. Why did Heidegger and others construe others in such negative terms? Why does that come so naturally to us? And don't just say sin. But why is it natural for us to construe others in negative terms if at some level we know better?
It's easier to see someone else as an obstacle to what I want. If those obligations do exist within relationship, then in some ways the other person is sort of like a roadblock for me. If I'm trying to just pursue what I want purely.
It always gives you someone else to blame.
Yeah.
Right? I know, there's always something external to me that is the problem.
That's right.
And we want, we want to define authenticity as the sort of combination of all of our disordered loves. This is what the real me is. The things that I want to go and do that might be offensive to others, kind of thing. And so the others are the ones hindering me from getting there.
Yeah. And that issue of blame runs deeper, because maybe to change the metaphor, if I have wounds in myself, it's easier to say those wounds came from someone else. It's harder to admit that I've done some of them to myself.
Yeah.
So having somebody else to blame is really confusing.
I wonder also is we're image bearers, and so one thing that we're drawn to we want people, others, to reflect an image that we have of ourselves, a positive image. And they don't do that because they may be reflecting something a little bit more true to us, about ourselves that we don't want to deal with. And so then they become an obstacle.
Yeah, they can become also by telling the truth, and there's someone to blame. And I think he does a good job in the chapter of being honest about the fact that sometimes they're actually blameworthy. I mean, there is a current in our culture to shift blame, and it's been there since the garden. We want to shift blame on others, we want to blame others for our problems. But there's also the reality that other people do bad things, that other people do harm. The book we're reading on Thursday is called "You Are Not Your Own," and we've just gotten to the chapter where he's actually starting to expound the positive. Like for the first 4 chapters, he's kind of been looking at the negative side of it, of what does trying to belong to yourself actually do to you? How does it damage you? But in chapter 5, he kind of begins to switch gears and say, the answer to this whole mess that we've been diagnosing here is that you don't actually belong to yourself. He said, but I have to recognize, before we get to that, I have to deal with this up front, that's a really scary idea to a lot of people. And that is, you don't belong to yourself. It's a really scary idea, and for good reason. He says, because the people who we belong to have done bad things. They've done things to hurt us. They've done things to harm us. They have let us in. They have brought out the worst impulses in us sometimes. That's the story Augustine famously tells about the pears, right? Because I wouldn't have done that alone, but in a group, I was carried along, by the gang, by the mob mentality to do this bad thing that I knew I didn't even really want to do. And so the group, there was something true about the idea that the other did drag me away from being the person I wanted to be. And we see even some of that in the scriptures, where Paul talks about bad company corrupting good morals. That's there. That is a true idea. And so there is the real possibility, that others will not lead you in the way that you would have you to go, or that others will do harm to you. They will be to blame. And so we have to acknowledge that. All right? But what Smith wants us to say is that okay, once you've acknowledged that, what you have to see, and this is, I forgot to write on the page number, so somewhere after page 124, he says, the answer is not radical independence. Whoa. Such independence leads only to loneliness. If you are all about doing you, then you won't have friends. You will want them. You will still want, and this is my commentary. You will still want a sidekick. You want someone to come along for the ride, but nobody wants to be your sidekick. They want to be the main character. They want you to be their sidekick. And so, if you go for radical independence as opposed to belonging to others, being in community, you end up alone, even if you're in a crowd. This is what he says. This is not the reason that we're lonely when we're surrounded by people. Is that because we don't connect to people because we have defined them as a hindrance to who we really want to be. Anybody who wants to get on board with our agenda, anybody who wants to get on board our train, where we're going, our self-expression, that's great. We want them to come. We want a buddy on the road. All right? But we fear real community because community places obligations on us. Community won't let us do what we want to do. It makes us bow. And again, it reminds me of some of the things that Lewis writes about love. He said, if you love, you will be imposed upon. There's a reason that frat boys make fun of their friend who's fallen in love, say he's got a ball and chain, because he does. Now it's not a servile one, but the motives and the desires and the goals have now been redefined by another. And that's actually a good thing. But the world sees that as, oh, you're not being true to yourself. Where I think Scripture would point us in the other direction and say, no, in community, we can actually become our truest self if we understand the source of that. That's, again, where he's, that's the quote from Charles Taylor. He says, we thought we were our own liberators, but it turns out we were our own jailers. Which is, then kind of reflected in that quote. Smith says, what if authenticity is the source of our loneliness? I typed this wrong, so I don't know what I'm supposed to say. What if it's precisely this unquestioned, unrecognized construal of others as threats to my freedom and autonomy that has sequestered us? Is authenticity worth it, or could we imagine authenticity otherwise? And that's really what he's trying to get at. He said the problem is not authenticity. The problem is that we have defined it incorrectly. And so, I write down here, that last question really seems to be the point. Smith is not suggesting that we should be inauthentic. Rather, he wants us to see that there's a way to find authenticity in community that doesn't leave us lonely. And that's kind of where he's trying to get. And so, as you just hear that, okay, you hear this idea that there's a kind of authenticity that's found only in community. Where have you experienced that? Where has being in relationships with others really allowed you to know the person you were meant to be, the person you were created to be, the person you want to be? Have you experienced that at all? We talked earlier about how you experience sort of the threat of others, but where have you experienced the gift of friends, where others have really helped you to come into your own? What do you say?
Here.
Yeah. Well, hopefully that's the answer. Hopefully that's the answer we're going towards. But how so?
Well, I think of not just this group, but other groups of friends I've had that I have gotten close in friendship with, and we've invested a lot in each other's lives, and maybe work together or whatever, and how much meaningfulness and even pleasure came out of that, but it's a kind of pleasure that also requires a commitment, right? I realized that, I said this in a group a week or two ago, but just that, it takes me years of being with people regularly before I begin to really experience the pleasure of the relationship, because it just takes time for there to be enough depth in the relationship for it to really be pleasurable and beneficial to me in a really serious way. But that sounds like all that matters is whether I'm having fun or not. Whether it's a pleasure to me to be with people. But it's so
that's not the metric.
Happiness is always a byproduct of something else, right? It's never the main thing. And so when you're really in community with other people, that means you are there for them. You are ready to lay down your lives for them. And so it's in that kind of self-sacrifice that you find, these are people that are really benefiting me in very significant ways, that I'm receiving from. And I think, one of the pieces of this to tie into authenticity is that, I think that being a genuine person is really an important value. But in order for me to be a genuine person, I have to be willing to have my distorted perspectives on life challenged. And I have to be able to accept something that's true even when it's an unpleasant truth for me to have to embrace, about myself or about life or whatever. And it's in community very often that I discover these things that I wouldn't have seen otherwise. Even I think of my relationship with my wife, there are so many times in the history of our marriage that I have said something sort of critical to her, and so I just hate it when you do X, Y, or Z, I can't think of a specific example now because she's, practically perfect in every way, but I would say, I don't like it when you do this to me. She said, well, you do that to me all the time, And when I think about it for a moment, I realize she's absolutely right. I'm way worse at it than she is. And yet I'm so like offended when she does it to me, and I'm not realizing what I'm doing. So that's a part of me being authentic, is recognizing, oh wait, I just really need God's forgiveness here, and I need to somehow be redeemed from who I really am on the deepest level, and then I can be truly who I am.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like authenticity as fallen people has to include, like the real me has to include something bad. And by God's grace, we're being redeemed and sanctified and made more human than we were before, but it usually comes from the outside, right? Something from, or someone from the outside of me kind of breaks in and is like, they put their finger on something. Like, where my mind went was early on as a pastor, an older guy in the Presbyterian took me out for coffee, and I was sharing with him a conflict, a pastoral challenge that I was trying to work through. And, I was looking at this side and that side and looking at all these different angles. And I was like, well, I think this is the solution. And at one point, he just kind of stopped me and he nailed me to the wall. He's like, it sounds like you're behaving kind of cowardly right now. And like that word just shocked me. Like I had not conceived of myself in that way. But as soon as he said it, I was like, no, that's exactly right. That's what I've been doing. But that wouldn't have happened just if I had kept turning the wheels myself.
Others?
What is Heidegger's definition of authenticity?
Yeah, I mean, I have to find an exact quote, but he's basically defining authenticity as, as following your own heart and desires without
Just complete 100% individualism.
Yes. Yeah. Well, he uses the language. Yeah. I mean, he's the one who uses the language of the they as enemy. The they, the other, is the enemy of your authenticity because they will place expectations on you. They will place obligations on you. And so, to be truly authentic, you have to not care what anybody else thinks or what anybody else expects. You have to totally let it fall in. You be you. That's kind of the Disney summation of it.
Coming out of the tradition of Hume and Nietzsche, Ubermensch, there's a Superman. We should attain that ourselves. What's odd is he was an avid member and supporter of the Nazi Party. So, we all live with those contradictions.
Yeah.
But yeah, so it was the whole turn to self of we cannot know anything outside of ourselves. We don't know what's within. Therefore, you really don't matter to me. It's just what I'm.
Yeah, it's interesting because, he's trying to say, it's all by yourself, and yet you can't do it. He's an existentialist, and yet you can't do it without reference to others.
Yeah.
So,
Or
he has his own contradiction.
Yeah.
Be yourself, which means you're with them.
Yeah.
But by referencing them, you're
Dependent on them.
like, yeah.
I mean, he had deep relationships with others. Gadamer was a close friend of his, and they spent a lot of time together. I mean, it's just like, no, he was just not consistent.
Sorry.
What were you going to say right there?
Well, yeah, the irony, right? Who did he write the book for? Right? Why write it down at all? He's not engaging with others.
It's a very rather obvious contradiction.
It just seems to me, even when, like, the point David was making, and saying, even when you're not directly confronted by something, the indirect confrontation of seeing some beautiful, noble thing in someone around you shapes who you want to be, right? You may think you're this way, and then you see someone who's really that way, and you're like, now I understand. And then, so that helps you actually become the thing that you thought you already were, right? And so, what it
back to the very first point here is there is an insuppressible push towards community built into us as human beings. So that even when we go into the road, we need a buddy. We need someone there. Now, what we want as existentialists is for someone who will just simply affirm. Someone who will simply reflect. Well, that's never going to happen, obviously, because they're all individual human beings who want to be affirmed as well. And so there's, what causes fights and quarrels among when everyone's trying to get their own way. That's the source of the tension. And so again, we come back to this idea. I think we're getting to it. That really what is needed is a redefinition of authenticity. And I've told you about this book before. It's a book that's sitting on my desk that I've never read, but I love the title. And it's a book. The title of the book is "Be True to Yourself." And the subtitle is how to find authenticity in being the person God created you to be. And I have no idea if it's a good book or not. It's written for teenagers. It might. I think it was written by a youth pastor. It might not be a great book, but the concept is so good. It's something I'll read it. But that idea is actually where he's getting at here too. He says, how does authenticity really work? We want to be authentic people, but being an authentic person is not being true to our sinful desires. Our sinful desires are parasites. Our sinful desires are leading us to death. Our sinful desires are the things of which we are ashamed. He says putting those things into being is not where you find authenticity. It's not where you find true life. True life can only be found in who we were, in seeking to become who we were created to be. And so there's let's see if I can find the quote. He says that, let's see, I don't have it on the page. He says, this is my summary of it. He says, but true authenticity isn't found in answering the call of an echo chamber, where we're the only ones speaking. Rather, true authenticity is found in answering the call of the one who made us for himself. True friends are those who help us to become the men we were created to be. And so again, authenticity is found not in conforming to some standard that I've created for myself, with my own sinful desires, but true authenticity is actually found in conforming. As hard as that is for the modern self to hear, it's found in conforming to the image of the glory of Christ, the true man. We become more authentic as we become more human. And that's an easy thing to say. It's a really hard thing for us to buy into. Because there is so much push, not just from the world. I mean, the world's pushing, but there's so much push even just from our own flesh. Those standard enemies that we always talk about in the church, the world, the flesh, and the devil, they are real. They are pushing against us, and they are pushing us to conform to what? Conform to our sinful desires. But authenticity is not actually found there. That's a false authenticity. That's what the world thinks authenticity is, but that's an authenticity that's not actually life. And so we have to learn to convince ourselves that where we're going to find life is in conforming to the image of the glory of Christ, is in becoming the men we were created to be. Think of Paul's exhortation at the beginning of Ephesians 4, right? It's kind of strange language because he says, live lives worthy of the calling with which you have been called. It's redundant. You're like, okay, what's going on there? And some of the modern translations try to kind of smooth that out a little bit, but I think the redundancy is actually helpful. You've been called to a calling. There's both the action of being called, and there's the thing to which you are called. You have been called to a calling, and that calling is to be an image bearer of God, which is obviously incarnated in the person of Jesus Christ. It's attaining to the full measure of the stature of Christ is where we find authenticity. And that is why we need to be in a community that agrees on the goal. Like one of the reasons that we struggle to find authenticity in the world is because everybody's defining it for themselves and there's no agreed upon standards. And you can kind of find a little bit of camaraderie in a tribe, if you've all sort of agreed to a certain thing up front. But those things are very seldom, or those things are never big enough to actually hold a community together for long. if you've read, I just finished Carl Trueman's book, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, this week. It's another one of those books that's sat on my shelf for a long time, but I finally read it. And so, but in that book, he talks about the fact how, even like the LGBTQ alliance is inherently unstable because they all have separate interests. Like all the different letters have their own interests. He says, as they win cultural ascendancy, as they're not bound together by their opposition to the other, that coalition is going to fall apart. He says because they're each going to start then to, and you've actually seen this a little bit with within feminist circles and lesbians versus transgenders, and like the tensions are already starting to rise because the tribes have to get smaller and smaller and smaller until you're back down to a tribe of one. That doesn't actually work. The only group that really has any hope of offering this kind of this type of community is a group that allows the goal, the paradigm to be defined from the outside. And that's what we have. That's what we have in the church. We have a story, a meta-narrative that tells us we were created by God, we were created for God. We were created in His image. And it's only there that we're going to find it. And so friendship and community gets redefined as those people who are going to walk with you, towards that goal. You're on the road, but you're not on the road for the road's sake. You're not on the road to a destination of your own choosing. You're on the road that has been marked out for you by your Heavenly Father, by your Maker. And if you will walk that road together, that's where you're going to find the deepest sort of friendships. And this is why he says the church is as bad a job as we do at it. The church is where this can happen. The church is where you can find these kinds of friendships, where you can find people who can walk alongside you. So again, I just ask you, how? You've already talked about it a little bit, but how have you experienced this in the church? How have you experienced it in the church, where you've been in a community where people can help you become the man you were created, live a life worthy of the calling that you've been called? And of course, I'm going to just follow up with that with the question of how can we do this better? So I'm not assuming we do this perfectly, but how have you experienced this, even if just in small tastes?
It takes a great deal of ability to be a great ground and say, be seen, be seen in a community where you're supposed to have it all together, where we talk about grace and holiness and sheer perfection, and to actually be seen and share what is that, what is dying to be reflecting, what's the nitty-gritty, to be real, to be transparent. That is the greatest gift as far as brothers and brotherhood that a man can give to another man. Is like, I trust you with myself, and here's what I need prayer for, here's what I need, here's what I'm coward about, here's what I'm strong about, and recognize that I have blind spots that I don't even see, and that to trust someone to boldly, kindly love, to confront, to restore in those areas. And it's the greatest thing, potential that we have in the church. I think it's also the greatest obstacle that we have in the church, because it's so, not like devil's advocate, but that's why there are other demonic groups out there, because for them that is their church, that is their community, and though it will fail miserably in some ways, that is a great opportunity that the church has to become a safe place for some of those minority groups without compromising the gospel at all.
Yeah. Others?
Well, I think there's, one of the things that we've done well at Trinity is there are lots of opportunities for being together with people in different formats. We have groups like this where, it's nice that we can occasionally split out and do men and women separately, but we don't always do that. But we have like Sunday school type more training kinds of experiences, but then there's also groups where we get together with others, like Thursday lunch, where we're it's a little more informal, but we still talk about something, sort of focus for our conversation and that kind of thing. I think for me, like, I've been reflecting in the last few years about like the old kind of men of the synagogue, you know, the old Testament or whatever, like that would sit at the city gates, you know, and just kind of, I don't know, argue over points of the law or something like that. I mean, like for me, this is something that is one of the great pleasures of life, you know, like that we get together and we talk about things that are really important, but in a personal way, you know, kind of trying to apply these things to our lives together and getting to know each other in the process kind of thing. And so, I mean, like since I've been here, I mean, I'm in a different stage of life than a lot of others are. I mean, my kids are grown now, so a little more freedom than I used to, but like I have something almost every single day where I'm doing that kind of a thing. And that is so edifying. I mean, it's just really wonderful. Yeah.
You mentioned the importance of letting yourself be known. I think that's a huge part of what allows communities to move forward. And you obviously can't jump straight there with everybody, and you'll never be there with everybody, but developing those types of relationships where you can really allow yourself to be known. But there's also a flip side of that, of actually getting to know people, listening to their story, remembering their story. One of the shows I've been introduced to by my daughter since she's been home is what's it called, The Good Place? You guys seen this? So in the second episode of The Good Place, the soulmates or whatever, I can't pronounce his name either, but the guy from Senegal, genius. So he's like, he asks the blonde, I don't know terrible names, this is revealing a lot about me, isn't it? But, whatever the blonde's name is, he's like, tell me one thing about me. She's like, well, you don't know anything about me either. And he lists off all these things. He's like, well, I know you were born in Phoenix, and then you were to school in Tempe, and now you moved back to Arizona, and now you do this. He's like, how do you know all that? He's like, because you haven't stopped talking about yourself since I met you. But he was listening. He was actually getting to know. And I think that's the other side of the coin. I mean, you have to allow yourself to be known, but you also actually have to listen. But even that is not enough, right? It's not enough just to be in a community where you're known and know others, because that other piece that we talked about here of the clear goal of what are we wanting to become? What does it mean to edify? To build up. It's to be built up in Christ. And the fact that we're trying to move each other there, like we're trying to become that. And Ronnie mentioned earlier about the power of vision. I think that's something that my brother talks about a lot. The power of the beauty of Christ. He said, there's lots of things like disciplines and things that can change us. He says, but one of the most powerful things is just to see the beauty of Christ. He says, because when we see, it's what you're doing on Sunday school, right? Gentle and lowly. When you see Christ as patient, when you see him as kind, when you see him as compassionate, you can't help but be in awe of that beauty. And you can't help, you were created to resonate with that. You were created to want to emulate that. That's why Paul tells us to set our mind on these types of things. Because as we meditate upon these kind of things, we are going to be drawn to them. It's not that we're going to embody them perfectly right away, of course not. But I heard Randy Wood give a lecture one time over at Lee, where he says, if you ever see Christ truly, you cannot but love him. He says, because his beauty is so profound, his beauty is what actual beauty is, and you were created to resonate with it. It says, so if the more you see of Christ, the more you will love him. And then, following Jesus himself, he said, and the more you love him, the more you will want to obey him, because you will want to be like this beautiful person. And I think we've all felt that at some level. But that's part of what community does to us. We see, in a person here, a person there. We see a kind of generosity, we see a kind of patience, we see a kind of kindness. And I'm like, whoa, I want to be that, you know. And it's in community with true friends that, we are imposed upon. You don't get to follow your own desires. You know, there are obligations placed upon you. You don't get to do your own thing. You don't get to go your own way. But those restrictions, this is an illustration that Keller uses in his book. What's the book that made him famous? What's it called? The White Book. The Reason for God. Yes. So the Reason for God. And one of the complaints that he's pushing against is called the straitjacket. Christianity is a straitjacket. It's going to restrict me. I don't want that. And he tries to make the argument that it's actually only in the right restrictions that you're going to find your freedom. Of course, the classic example is the fish. Only if you keep your fish in the water. If you set your fish free from the water, you've not done them any favors. And for us, the restrictions that give us freedom are bound up in the character of God, because that's who we were made to reflect. That's who we were made to be like. And so, as you think about, you mentioned some of the things we do already, some of the things we do well. This is obviously a big part of what we try to do. But how can we facilitate and cultivate these kind of relationships even more than we already do? Maybe it's not at a programmatic level. Maybe it's just at your own schedule and you've got yourself involved, in different things almost every day. Well, like you said, not everybody's schedule these days allows that. For some people, that would be abandoning the actual responsibilities of fatherhood or of their marriage. But given where you're at, what are some things you could do, to take advantage of or to maybe offer this kind of community to others? Or what's some things you already enjoy doing? If you're already doing it.
Something that I've done for a while, and it kind of ebbs and flows. All of us kind of do. There are 4 guys who we went through seminary together, but we actually knew each other prior to that. I was actually the camp counselor for all 3 of these guys when they were in high school. And we, then when I worked at Rich Haven, I hired them, and then after that, we went through seminary together. Now we're all ordained and scattered around the world, but we use text to, using WhatsApp or, kind of whatever is the in vogue medium at the time. We create a little group so that we can just interact with each other at any time, sending out prayer requests. It kind of ebbs and flows, and I think I have, maybe it's because I'm borderline Luddite. I don't make use of that. Like I think I could. And some of it is, I think that some of it is a reticence on my part to really be known. So for me, taking a step toward, just sharing, like, hey, this is what's happening inside of me right now, and giving them an opportunity to interact with that. Because I trust these guys totally. But I say that I trust them totally, and yet I'm still reticent sometimes. So that'd be an action step for me.
Others?
Well, this isn't really a suggestion for improvement, but I think one of the things that is a good thing to keep on doing is like different kinds of formats of being together. Like even the work days or retreats or like different kinds of fellowship meals or whatever, but in all the different types of things that are different from each other that we do, I think those are important. I was listening to a podcast a while ago where the guy was talking about a book he had written, and like in the book he says that And, but, you know, like, guys are particularly bad at really forming deep friendships with others, and they're very lonely as a result.
Yeah, and that takes, like you said, that takes being together in a variety of ways. You know, I think that's part of it. I mean, one of the books again, blank on the title. I think it's called Total Church. You know, the book, you know, basically starts off with just this question of, hey, when you think about somebody getting involved at church, what do you think of? He says, probably you think of getting involved in a program, you know, becoming a Sunday school teacher or being an usher. He said that really needs to become secondary. And he's right, pastors. He said that needs to become secondary when you're thinking about what an involved member looks like. You know, an involved member is someone who's having dinner at somebody's house on Tuesday night. You know, that, you know, he said someone might never have a formal role, you know, but if they're involved in that way, then they're involved. They're an involved member, and they're being encouraged, and they're encouraging others, and they're sharing their life, and that's a beautiful thing, and that's really what we're after. But your point is that takes, you have to proactively pursue that. If you want to do it, because it's hard. I mean, it is. People are wired differently, obviously, but you know, if I'm not proactive, I will end up in my study all week by myself. You know, and probably enjoy it. You know, be happy not to have meetings. You know, yeah, for a while. You're right, but only for a while. You're right, because that's easy. You know, it's less default. You know, relationships cause responsibilities, and so you know, I've been out to dinner with some of you. I've been in your house, I've been to dinner, you know, and those are beautiful things, you know, that were initiated, and that just as much as we can do that kind of thing, and we're in a community that recognizes where we're going, and I think that's one of the beauties of Trinity and of any Bible-believing church. We've got the goals set out before us. We want to become mature disciples. We want to become image bearers of Christ. We want to put off our old man and put on Christ. But that happens as we share our lives with one another. It happens as we do it in community. And you know, you won't do it with everybody, obviously, all the time. But the more you're able to proactively seek out relationships, have people over, who was it that was telling me? I think they were talking about you, Robert, you know, having people over to your house and saying it doesn't have to be an entirely fancy meal. It can be something very simple. And I don't know what you served, but they were like, but they were saying it as a compliment. They said they just had us over. You know, it was a very simple meal, but it was beautiful, and it gave them courage to do the same thing. You know, and they said, hey, you know, just have people over. You know, just have people over for sandwiches, have people over for a pot of soup, have people over for what'd you say? Yeah, that's a beautiful thing. It's something you can just put in the crock pot, and you don't have to. It's a one pot meal, you know, and yet you can have people over to share. So anyway, I guess thinking on this chapter, you know, we want to be authentic, but we also want to belong. And the world doesn't know how to bring those two things together. But hopefully the church can show us that those things actually belong intricately together. Because it's only in community that we can actually become the people we were created to be. And it's only in becoming who we were created to be that we actually achieve true authenticity. And so, again, that's what I love about this book. It does really resonate with me, because that's something I need to hear. So, the next chapter is enlightenment. So what do I want to do? What do I want? I want to be rational. So we're going to go to that chapter exactly, but we'll read it this next week. We'll come back to it. So let me close this in prayer. Father God, thank you for your mercy and your grace to us in Christ. Thank you for the call that you have placed upon us. Father, I pray that you would give us the grace to answer that call, not just as individuals, but in the community as brothers. Father, that we would more and more become the men you've called us to be as we walk the road that you've set before us. We pray this in Jesus' name.